In 1914, as Europe plunged into the massive meat grinder of the First World War, the United States watched quietly from across the Atlantic. The American public had a very clear message for their leaders: keep us out of Europe's bloody and destructive conflicts at all costs. Instead of fighting, they wanted to focus entirely on building their own booming industries and expanding their growing economic power at home. But maintaining complete isolation is incredibly hard when the rest of the world is burning. The oceans were no longer the perfect shields they once seemed. In 1915, a German U-boat torpedoed and sank the ocean liner Lusitania, tragically killing 128 Americans and outraging the nation. Tensions boiled over rapidly. The American public was furious, yet many still desperately hoped to avoid sending their young men into the deadly European trenches. Then, 2 years later, came the discovery of the infamous Zimmermann telegram, a secret German plot proposing an alliance with Mexico against the U.S. This shocking betrayal was the absolute final straw. In 1917, America officially entered the Great War, abandoning its strict stance of neutrality. Over 2 million young American doughboys crossed the dangerous ocean, bringing much-needed fresh troops and massive resources to the heavily exhausted European battlefields. Their arrival provided a crucial boost in morale and firepower, completely helping to tip the balance of the war in favor of the Allied forces. By November 1918, the deafening guns finally fell silent across Europe. The Great War was over, but the human cost was devastatingly high. Deeply disillusioned by the unprecedented scale of the global slaughter, the grieving American public strongly demanded an immediate retreat from world affairs. They wanted absolutely nothing more to do with European politics. The U.S. Senate even fiercely refused to join the newly created League of Nations. America firmly locked its diplomatic doors, retreating back into its protective shell, hoping to never have to fight another foreign war ever again. The nation turned its back on the world, believing they were safe. But history had other plans, and the giant wouldn't sleep forever. The 1920s absolutely roared. America was mass-producing cars at an incredible pace, and vibrant jazz music filled the lively city air. Innovative assembly lines completely revolutionized daily life. Cities grew taller with magnificent skyscrapers reaching for the clouds in a new era of prosperity. The booming stock market seemed like a magical, one-way elevator to endless wealth, making everyday citizens believe they could easily become millionaires overnight. But suddenly, in October 1929, that invisible elevator cable violently snapped. The stock market crashed with a devastating and terrifying force. Almost overnight, massive fortunes simply vanished into thin air, leaving families desperate. This catastrophic financial collapse triggered what the world now knows as the Great Depression. Panic spread like wildfire across the country. Thousands of banks completely failed, wiping out the life savings of ordinary, hard-working American citizens in days. To make matters much worse, massive, suffocating dust storms violently ravaged the central farmlands, creating the tragic and terrifying environmental disaster called the Dust Bowl. Millions of desperate Americans suddenly lost their jobs and homes, forced to stand in endless, heartbreaking breadlines just to survive another difficult day. The entire nation was truly on its knees, struggling through the darkest economic period in its history, desperately searching for a glimmer of hope. Then came a new leader, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who promised a massive recovery plan known as the New Deal to save the struggling country. The federal government aggressively stepped in, creating massive public works projects like the incredible Hoover Dam to finally put millions of people back to work. Bridges, roads, and national parks were built across the continent. It was a brutal decade characterized by intense internal struggle and remarkable national survival. Slowly but surely, the American giant began to heal its own massive internal wounds, completely focused on rebuilding its shattered domestic economy from the ground up. However, while the United States was entirely looking inward, dark and extremely dangerous shadows were rapidly expanding across the oceans in both Europe and Asia. Ruthless dictators and aggressive empires were violently redrawing the world map, setting the stage for a global conflict that America could not ignore forever. Throughout the 1930s, the fragile global world order began to completely collapse under the heavy weight of rising, aggressive, authoritarian regimes. Ruthless dictators quickly rose to absolute power across Europe, violently suppressing opposition and rapidly building up massive, heavily armed military machines. Meanwhile, in the East, Imperial Japan aggressively expanded its growing empire, invading neighboring territories across Asia in a brutal quest for resources. Yet, despite these terrifying global threats, the American public remained stubbornly isolationist. Congress passed strict neutrality acts to keep the country safe. It became officially illegal to sell weapons or loan money to any nations at war. Americans believed the vast oceans would protect them. But in 1939, the illusion of peace shattered. Hitler invaded Poland with overwhelming force, and the Second World War officially began. The fascist war machine swept across the continent. Soon, Great Britain stood almost entirely alone, bravely fighting against the unstoppable Axis powers. President Roosevelt knew America couldn't hide forever. He boldly declared that the United States must become the great arsenal of democracy. The U.S. began sending critical military supplies, food, and weapons to help Britain survive, while still carefully keeping American soldiers out of combat. This massive industrial effort slowly began to wake the sleeping economic giant, preparing the nation's factories for a conflict they desperately hoped to avoid. However, while eyes were fixed on Europe, the geopolitical tension in the vast Pacific Ocean was rapidly reaching a highly dangerous breaking point. To halt Japan's aggressive military expansion, the United States made a bold move and completely cut off their vital oil and scrap metal exports. This devastating economic embargo backed the Japanese empire into a corner, forcing their military leaders to deeply plan a desperate and highly risky strike. A giant ticking clock echoed across the Pacific. The protective oceans were suddenly no longer wide enough to keep the spreading fire safely away. The United States was desperately trying to buy time, but the inevitable, fiery storm was already fully forming just over the dark, turbulent horizon. December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. In a devastating surprise attack, Japanese bombers struck the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The American Pacific Fleet was severely crippled, and tragically, over 2,400 Americans died. The isolationist dream shattered in a single morning. The sleeping giant was violently thrown out of its protective shell. Outrage swept across the nation, uniting a previously deeply divided American public instantly. Almost overnight, millions of brave young American men rushed to military recruiting stations to enlist, eager to fight back against the Axis powers. But the real miracle happened back at home. The United States immediately realized that modern wars are won in factories, not just on battlefields. American car factories immediately stopped making civilian vehicles. Instead, they rapidly began churning out thousands of heavy tanks, tough military jeeps, and weapons. Assembly lines were completely overhauled to produce massive B-24 bomber planes, building them at an absolutely staggering and unprecedented record-breaking pace. Because millions of young men were sent off to fight the war, a massive labor shortage threatened to slow down this vital production. To solve this, millions of strong, capable women confidently stepped into the heavy industrial factories, taking on tough jobs they were previously denied. Symbolized by the iconic Rosie the Riveter, these female workers became the absolute backbone of the American wartime economy and military supply chain. This incredible nationwide effort became the greatest and fastest industrial mobilization in human history, fundamentally changing the American workforce forever. The United States fully transformed its massive, booming domestic economy into an unstoppable, overwhelming weapon of war that shocked the entire world. By working around the clock, American factories were soon easily outproducing all of the Axis powers combined, burying their enemies under sheer industrial might. The reluctant giant was finally fully awake, armed to the teeth, and completely determined to finish the global conflict it had tried to avoid. The world would never be the same again. America was no longer just a participant. It was the powerful engine driving the Allied war machine. America was now fighting a brutal two-front war across the globe. In Europe, they joined forces with the Allies to break Fortress Europe. On June 6, 1944, famously known as D-Day, thousands of brave American soldiers stormed the heavily fortified beaches of Normandy, France. Despite the horrific casualties, it was a massive, bloody turning point that successfully pushed the Allied forces deep toward the heart of Germany. Meanwhile, half a world away in the vast Pacific Ocean, U.S. forces engaged in a grueling, strategic island-hopping campaign against the Japanese Empire. American troops faced incredibly fierce resistance, taking heavy casualties in brutal battles for tiny but crucial islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The fighting on both fronts was unimaginably intense. But the war's most decisive and terrifying weapon was actually being built in absolute secret. Deep in the isolated deserts of New Mexico, the top-secret Manhattan Project gathered the world's most brilliant scientific minds for a singular purpose. These scientists were desperately racing against time and enemy nations to mathematically unlock the terrifying, apocalyptic power of the atom. It was an unprecedented scientific and military gamble that required vast, hidden facilities and ultimately cost the nation over $2 billion. As May 1945 finally brought a hard-fought, celebratory victory in Europe following Nazi Germany's complete and unconditional surrender, the celebrations were cut short. The brutal and relentless Pacific War raged on fiercely, with the Japanese military refusing to back down. American military planners projected that a direct land invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost hundreds of thousands of Allied lives. Following the sudden passing of Roosevelt, the newly sworn-in president, Harry Truman, inherited this massive burden in a terrible choice. He was fully briefed on the successful testing of the atomic bomb, a device that could instantly wipe entire cities off the map. Truman now faced arguably the most difficult and highly consequential decision in all of human history: drop the bomb or continue the bloody invasion. In August 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, unleashing unimaginable apocalyptic destruction. The horrifying and unprecedented scale of this brand new nuclear weapon forced Japan's immediate and unconditional surrender, finally bringing World War II to a close. The world was forever changed. But unlike Europe and Asia, which tragically lay in absolute ruins, the American mainland remained completely untouched by bombs. America emerged from the ashes of the war, holding nearly half of the entire world's wealth, possessing the ultimate weapon, and standing as a giant. They completely abandoned their old isolationist dreams, playing a key role in founding the United Nations and stepping onto the global stage permanently. From that decisive moment in 1945, the United States confidently accepted the heavy and complex mantle of being a global superpower. Today, the U.S. military maintains hundreds of active bases spread around the entire world, effectively acting as the so-called global policeman of modern times. However, this massive legacy of global intervention is increasingly being questioned back at home. The trillions of dollars spent on foreign wars have sparked anger. Deep political polarization has fractured the nation. Today, the United States often feels like a country deeply divided into 2 fiercely opposing realities. Modern American citizens are now urgently asking a very difficult question. Should the country still carry the heavy weight of the entire world on its shoulders? Or is it finally time to focus inward once again, to urgently repair the deep, growing cracks threatening the foundation of the American giant itself? The United States went from a sleeping, isolationist nation to the world's ultimate superpower. But balancing global responsibility and domestic peace remains their biggest challenge. Will the giant continue to lead the world order, or will it retreat back into its shell? Only time will truly tell us the answer. What do you think about America's role in the world? Subscribe to our channel and join us next time as we explore the Cold War era. Remember, history always has many different angles, and this is just one way to tell it. You can find our reference sources in the description below.